Thank you everyone for coming to our preseason forecast webinar. We're joined today by some great scientists that have been doing really outstanding work in forecasting Bristol Bay sockeye runs in recent years. And so they've got presentations for you today. And up first is going to be Chris Boatwright, who is a program manager and research scientist with the University of Washington's Alaska Salmon Program. And he's going to be presenting on the 2023 Bristol Bay forecast and reviewing what goes into that. So please take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Andy. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'll share my screen here. Did it share?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. All right. Now, does everyone see that?
Looks great.
All right. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to start us off with a review of the 2023 University of Washington FRI, Bristol Bay Sockeye Salmon preseason forecast. So I tend to like to start the review of the preseason forecast with the most basic table we generate with our forecasting sockeye preseason forecast. And so that's what's on the screen now. What you're looking at in the body of this table, and the values are in millions of fish, is 36 individual predictions. So that's individual predictions. That's a prediction for each of the 9 major river systems by each of the 4 dominant age groups of sockeye that make up almost the entire run coming back to Bristol Bay. Those dominant age classes are 1-2s, 1-3s, 2-2s, and 2-3s. So these 36 individual predictions sum to get to what we expect back to Bristol Bay in 2023, which is right at 50 million sockeye. So specifically 49.98 million sockeye on the forecast. Let's see. Not sure why. Okay. So from there, I like to take a step back and take a look at the primary data set that the forecast is built on. So what we're looking at here on screen are Bristol Bay sockeye salmon returns 1963 to 2022. It's this historical return data coupled with the age data collected by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game that are the primary data sets that go into our forecast. I think so. On the screen here, each of the returns to each of the 9 major river systems is represented in a different color. Really, this is a history of Bristol Bay in terms of sockeye salmon. We can see the first thing that jumps out is in yellow, just how dominant the Kvichak River system was for Bristol Bay sockeye production for much of the 20th century. And then as we moved into the 1990s and present, production really became diversified. So these runs, and in particular, these big runs of the last 8 years were characterized by strong production across all the river systems. And then, of course, the last 2 most interesting, I think, these last 2 years where we successively broke the records with a 2020 total return of greater than 72 million, and then last year, of course, over 83 million. So also, now that some of our predictions use machine learning methodology, we're able to incorporate data sets such as sea surface temperatures and abundance of other salmon species during Bristol Bay sockeye's ocean phase into these forecasts. And that brings us to the forecast table as we release it each November On the left-hand side there, that's those 36 individual predictions we started off with. We can see those are summed by river system, and then of course to the Bristol Bay total run forecast of 49.98 million sockeye. To the right of that, we give estimates of escapement. So these are estimates of escapements that we would expect from total runs by river system there to Bristol Bay. To the right of that, we give an estimate of Bristol Bay fish we think will be taken in the South Peninsula catch. We remove both the estimate of escapement and the Bristol Bay South Penn catch from the river totals to come up with an inshore harvest estimate by river system and total as well. So for a total run of 50 million sockeye back to Bristol Bay in 2023, we would expect an inshore harvest right at 35 million sockeye. So I think what's important is to consider the two ocean percentage in the catch and the run and the harvest to three ocean percentage. And what our forecast suggests is that we're right at about 60% three ocean fish. So the main driver of fish size as you pull them in will be ocean age. So three ocean fish, of course, sockeye that have spent three years in the ocean or 3 winters in the ocean. We also take that estimate of inshore harvest and we translate that into the preseason forecast in pounds. We organize this table, our forecast, our 2023 preseason forecast in pounds of sockeye by commercial fishing districts. So from an inshore harvest of 35 million sockeye, we would expect that to translate to about 195 million pounds in the harvest. As well, we can see we get an idea of how we would expect that to be distributed across Bristol Bay. We see that our forecast calls for Nushagak to get the largest proportion at over 70 million pounds. And then, of course, very strong proportions at a bit more than 55 million pounds for both the Naknek-Quejack district and the Igigik district. So in order to get a forecast of pounds, we have to come up with estimates of sockeye weights. What's popped up in the middle of the screen is the data set that goes into those estimates. The red dots connected by the red line are average weights across the time series 1980 to 2022 for three ocean sockeye. And below that, of course, the smaller two ocean sockeye are shown with blue dots connected by a blue line. I think what's apparent here is that these really large returns have seen small fish. It's been known for quite a while that there is an inverse relationship between total run size to Bristol Bay and size of fish. So all of those runs from the last 5 years exceeded 58 million sockeye, and then of course many of them exceeded 60 million, and then of course the last 2 years both exceeded 70 million. So we think that if our forecast holds up and overall production for Bristol Bay does drop down to a total run size of about 50 million sockeye, we would expect to see some rise in fish size. So we used 4.6 pounds for two ocean and 6.2 pounds for three ocean sockeye to go into our preseason forecast in pounds. So I thought we'd take a real quick look, given the record-setting year you guys had last year. I thought we'd take a quick look at a little historical commercial catch data. What we see on screen now is the sockeye harvest in numbers of fish from 1980 to present. And so what we see is just how big last year was. The harvest exceeded 60 million sockeye. So certainly the biggest harvest by quite a bit on record. Then to put into context our expectations for 2023, the orange column that's popped up shows the 35 million or the 34.95 million harvest we would expect from this year's run. And then, of course, this is the same data. I've just shortened the time series and to 2018 to 2022 and left our expectations for 2023 with the orange column. Now I'm going to switch gears, and now what we see on screen in the blue columns is the data for the pounds harvested. So this is actual pounds harvested 2018 to 2022, and then for 2023 our expectations for pounds harvested at 195 million pounds of sockeye. Again, we see just how big last year was, but interestingly, despite the smaller expected harvest in terms of number of fish at 35 million, which is somewhat smaller than 2018 to 2022, we see that the number of pounds is fairly static for our expectations, and that has to do with run size and proportion of three ocean fish we expect in the sockeye harvest this coming year. So if you compare it to, say, a run such as 2021, of course, 2022 was to some degree off the charts, but if you compare it to 2021's run, you can see that it's very similar in terms of our expectations and for pounds, despite it being a somewhat smaller expected run. And that has to do with both size at age for two ocean and three ocean sockeye, and then of course the proportion of three ocean sockeye we expect in this harvest this year. So now anytime you're doing forecasts, to get the most out of those forecasts, you have to consider forecast performance in order to get the best interpretation or the best use of these forecasts. So this is a forecast plot we generate each year. It's a 2-panel plot. The bottom plot is the observed run totals for Bristol Bay, represented in blue data points connected by a dotted blue line. And then, of course, overlaid in that with the red line are the values for the FRI preseason forecast. The idea here is just to get an idea of how well these forecasts track onto the actual data. They do a fairly good job. We can see that over the last 7 years with these really big returns, the trend has been to somewhat under forecast. Now, a more specific look at forecast performance is the top plot here, which is percent deviation in forecast from actual returns. This time series runs from 2000 to 2022. And so the actual returns across this time series are set to the 0 line. And then, of course, the red columns that fall above are percent deviations that were over forecast. And the blue columns that fall below are percent deviations that were under forecast. And so across this time series, 2000 to 2022, our percent error, or specifically the mean absolute percent error, was 15.5%. So that is a review of our 2023 expectations. And with that, we will try to field any questions.
All right, well, thank you very much, Chris. Again, if you have any questions, just put it in the chat or maybe raise your hand at this point. We don't have to wait for folks to type. And you can raise your hand by hitting the little raise hand button at the bottom of the screen, or maybe it's the top, I'm not sure, on your computer. I don't see any hands going up right at the moment, but maybe I'll just ask, do you happen to know, Chris, off top of your head if that difference in forecast versus actuals for the harvest has been as different as the total run? You know, some years, depending on what escapement is, there's, you know, more or less difference. Just wondering if harvest estimates have been more accurate, less accurate, or about the same. I suppose I'd assume about the same, but
They tend to run very close. They tend to track with the forecast, the total run forecast.
we have a question from Michael Kane. How accurate have your projections been for fish size and weight?
Well, last year they were very accurate. So this series, these really big runs we've had, they've been very accurate after the first couple years. So by first couple years, I really mean 2015, the time series 2015 to present. For 2014 and 2015, our sizes were a little too big. I think that those runs came in bigger than expected, obviously. And as we begin to see this trend, we begin to redo how we were estimating those fish sizes, which was really to say we were using a shorter time span for average size. So over the last 5 years, they've been very accurate.
Luke, I think you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Do you know if either University of Washington or Fish and Game will come out with any new publication for forecast since the new King Salmon Management Plan came out? I'm just thinking as fishermen use the forecast to inform which district they're going to fish, you know, that it seems like that management plan could affect that forecast by, you know, on the order of millions of available harvest, which would, you know, right now it looks like the Nushagak has significantly more available for harvest than other districts, but it seems like with the new management plan that's pretty unlikely.
I don't think that, so yeah, so essentially it would change that estimate of escapement column. I don't know whether Fish and Game plans to release anything further that would address that. I don't suspect that we will, because we're a little unsure of exactly how it will affect it. I would guess there's a chance that the escapement total, and specifically for the Nushagak district, may go up by 800,000, a million fish. But that, of course, depends on a lot of different run dynamics that set up this year.
Yeah, a great question, Luke. And, you know, it might be as simple as taking some of the previous harvest and escapement numbers and, you know, giving a haircut. But it'd be interesting to see what Curry says about run timing in the Noosh later on in this webinar. Do we have any other questions? Kind of last call for questions for Chris before we move on. Okay. Oh, Travis is asking, is there a forecast model specifically for Noosh Kings?
Not one that we've generated.
Okay. All right, and then Stacy from Fish and Game says they will not be releasing an updated forecast this year. So we'll move on to Dr. Daniel Schindler, who is a professor and principal investigator with the University of Washington's Alaska Salmon Program. He has a special focus on how aquatic ecosystems respond to changing climate change and land use and how that interacts with fisheries. He has a long history with the Alaska Salmon Program and has studied salmon in Southwest Alaska since, the program has been studying salmon in Southwest Alaska since the 1940s. Today, Dr. Schindler is presenting on the state of the ocean climate for Bristol Bay sockeye salmon. So take it away, Daniel.
All right, thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone for showing up. The purpose of my presentation today is to give you a quick update on how the ocean climate conditions are playing out in the Northeast Pacific. These are the ocean conditions that the smolts encountered as they came, that we'll be seeing this year, and then of course temperatures in the ocean that you may experience during the fishing season. And I'll just start by acknowledging Nate Mantua with NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center, who provided many of the slides I'll show you today. So just to reference you to a couple slides here, look at the top panel here. What we're looking at is a map of, map of Alaska and the Gulf of Alaska here, and here's the Bristol Bay region. And what I'm showing in this color plot are what we call an anomaly, which is the difference in observed temperature at that site at that time from what you'd expect over the long-term average. And there's two plots here, one that's showing the previous to the last few years, so basically up to about 2010, the ocean conditions that smolts encountered leaving Bristol Bay that produced the biggest runs on record. And what you can see is the colors here are tending to be green and yellow, which tells you that smolts leaving Bristol Bay rivers have tended to have higher marine survival rates when the coastal temperatures are warmer than average. And if you look at the 10 lowest years of ocean survival, that's shown on the bottom panel, you can see the temperatures are bluish and purple, which says that when the coastal ocean temperatures are colder than average, we tend to see lower survival of those smolts. So this is what the maps look like prior to the last decade, when we saw these exceptionally warm temperatures associated with the warm blobs, as I've talked about previously, and many of you have heard from other places. And if we look at the last, say 2014 to 2019 ocean conditions in Bristol Bay, again, here's Alaska, here's the Alaska Peninsula, you can see we are seeing lots of bright oranges here. So these are on the order of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than average for that location at this time period of June to September, in this time period between 2014 and 2019. So basically, these record returns of salmon that we've seen the last few years were associated with these really exceptionally warm Eastern Bering Sea sea surface temperatures. So this relationship that we've seen in the past, where warmer ocean temperatures lead to higher marine survival, continue, and in fact are at a higher level in the last decade than they were observed for most of the last century. If we break this apart by years, so each one of these panels is a different year, and these are the years that fish left as smolts. And I just want to focus you in here on the summer of 2019, which is the summer the smolts would have left that produced that record return last year. You can see right here in Bristol Bay, it is intense red. These are temperatures that translate into 2.5 degrees Celsius, or about 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than average during that year. For those of you who remember, that was that year of exceptionally warm July temperatures in particular. There was a lot of reports of adult fish die-offs in the rivers. But the point is, last year's return of 83 million fish, which is the highest on record by a long shot, was associated with these unbelievably warm coastal temperatures in Bristol Bay. And if we look the last couple years, so here's 2020 and here's 2021, we've seen that really intense temperatures have dissipated a little bit. So the two ocean fish that we are expecting to see this year left as smolts in 2021. And you can see the temperature anomalies here are light green or even white down in the Gulf of Alaska. So that's more closer to the average conditions that we've seen over the recent few decades. So this translates nicely into what the forecast that Chris just presented talks about, which is slightly reduced returns compared to what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. So the 3 oceans that we're going to see this year left in 2020, and you can see they're slightly above average temperatures, and the 2 oceans that we'll see this year were very close to average coastal temperatures observed over the last couple of decades. So there was a lot of concern about these ongoing climate change and these particularly warm heat waves that hit the Gulf of Alaska and the Eastern Bering. And this I'll show you in a second here. Really the bottom line is that Bristol Bay smolts really benefited from those heat waves. And the last year or two, the intensity of those heat waves have dissipated a little bit. So that will probably translate into slightly lower returns than we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And that bears out in the forecast that Chris just presented. And if we put this in a time series, these are Eastern Bering Sea, or think of it as Bristol Bay sea surface temperatures from 1950 to 2022. And you can see again in degrees Celsius, typically the Eastern Bering during the summer is about 9.5 or 10 degrees. And during this last decade, starting about 2013, we were getting temperatures that were, a full degree and a half Celsius higher than average. And there's 2019 and 2016, which were literally off the charts. And then you can see the last 2 years are down closer to what we would consider average over this 1950 to the present time series. Same trend was seen in the Gulf of Alaska, which is relevant to Bristol Bay fish because after the smolts hit Bristol Bay, they'll migrate west along the Alaska Peninsula, turn the corner, and then most of their growth is achieved down in the Gulf of Alaska. So it was particularly warm during the last couple of years as well. But the last 2 has showed a little bit of moderation of that warming trend. One concern that people often has is with this ongoing climate change that we're eventually going to tip over the other side in terms of things getting too warm for Bristol Bay sockeye. And one way to think about this is to compare these 2 time series I just showed you for the Gulf of Alaska in red on top and the Eastern Bering in blue on the bottom. And you can see the Eastern Bering is always about 3 degrees Celsius cooler than the Gulf of Alaska. So during these heat waves, stocks that hit the Gulf of Alaska directly because the rivers flow directly into the Gulf of Alaska did not do very well. But the fish that left Bristol Bay rivers and hit the Eastern Bering are still hitting ocean that's relatively cool and seems to still be benefiting from ongoing climate warming. If we look at conditions right now, we're seeing a pretty big change in what has been observed over the last 10 years. So again, I'm showing you anomalies. So these are differences in temperature from what you'd expect at that place and at this time in this case, over the course of the whole Pacific. And here's the equator right there, the dotted line at 0 degrees latitude. And all this blue water up along the coast, including up into the Bering Sea and the Bristol Bay, throughout Gulf of Alaska is about average, but we're seeing lots of blue here, which means that the whole Eastern Pacific is relatively cool right now, relative to the long-term average starting in this case in 1991. And if you look back at the slides I presented last year, what we would have seen is a big blue patch of water right here on the equator. And that was the fingerprint of La Nina conditions, which have gone away. And now we're starting to see some yellows and reds appear right there at the equator, which is really a leading indicator of El Nino that's starting to develop. And right now that El Nino condition is associated with cool coastal waters, warm offshore waters. And this temperature fingerprint tends to be associated with lower survival rates of Bristol Bay smolts. we won't know whether that plays out for a couple of years yet, but right now, things are surprisingly cold along the coast, even though they're warm in offshore waters. And this is the sea surface temperature map from just a couple days ago. If we look at forecasts, this is a terrestrial forecast for the next summer. And this is where it's sometimes gets a little confusing, but the surface air temperatures that we see over the continents does not necessarily translate into ocean temperatures. So the forecast produced here for this coming summer, you're seeing red everywhere in most of North America and in Western Alaska, which suggests that the forecast is suggesting that it's going to be substantially warmer than average this summer in coastal Western Alaska, even though the coastal water temperatures might be cooler than average. And that was all I was going to present for the climate data. I mean, basically the take-home message is that this last decade has been so warm in the Eastern Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska that we've had to rescale our temperature graphs. And good news for Bristol Bay is that conditions seem to be correlated with really high survival of smolts in the ocean. So looking out over the long term with ongoing climate change, I think things look very optimistic for survival of for marine survival of Bristol Bay sockeye. The next year or two, though, we're moving into this El Nino pattern, which may have some slightly reduced marine survival rates of sockeye in the shorter term. So that's all I have for today, Andy. I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, well, raise your hand or put something in the Q&A.
And sorry, someone asked on the chat if the slides would be shared, and I think all of us can share our slides with Andy to distribute to you if you want to look at this in more detail.
Yeah, we'll probably put up a blog post on our website, and this will be posted to YouTube as well on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to kind of go back and rewatch it. Maybe while we're waiting for anybody that's thinking of a question, is there any way to kind of tease out with these El Nino and La Nina cycles, maybe how cold or warm it is now compared to the same point in the cycle, you know, say 10 years ago, or, you know, whenever we were last in that? I'm not sure if they're regular enough to really do that, but, you know, I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Andy. We could probably do that by picking out various, you know, El Nino's strengths of El Nino or La Nina signals and ask what was the temperature during those time periods. We haven't done that, but I could ask Nate Mantua if he has a way to do that. You know, part of the simple answer is that El Nino affects the California current more than it does coastal Alaska. So coastal Alaska, and it's in terms of temperature and effects on biological productivity, seems to be more correlated with the PDO and the NPGO rather than the El Nino cycle. If you're worried about California, El Nino can have big effects on coastal productivity. Don't seem to be quite as strong in Alaska.
Okay. And then with these cycles of the PDO and the El Nino and La Nina, have you seen back through history that they're relatively consistent, or are there times where, oh, it looks like we're going into this phase of El Nino and then whoop, it shifts or ends faster or switches faster, or, you know, or is it kind of in the middle?
Yeah, you're asking me a question sort of at the boundary of my knowledge about El Nino. In the case of PDO, which has been more relevant to Bristol Bay salmon or even Alaska salmon, you know, the big shift that we saw was in the mid-1970s, which is when the catches of Bristol Bay sockeye nearly doubled and persisted at really relatively high levels until the last decade. What's interesting is that the last decade, the PDO has kind of gone away, and this NPGO, which is yet another cycle, seems to have become the dominant cycle that affects coastal temperatures. So I would say there's not a real clear answer to how these various cycles add up to effects on salmon. We thought we really had the PDO figured out because it was such a predictable, pretty such increases in Bristol Bay sockeye until the last decade. And then the NPGO took over. We got these heat waves and the PDO doesn't seem to have as strong an effect anymore. So we can tell stories, but it's hard to make many specific predictions with those data sets.
Right, so it sounds like we have a little bit of an idea about what sort of trend or direction we're going, but it has changed in the past, and you can kind of get curveballs sometimes.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I guess the take-home message, I think, for today is that those really extreme heat waves have dissipated a little bit. Things are more moderate now. They're still warm enough that we should expect relatively high marine survival rates, but probably not as high as we've seen the last decade.
Right, so maybe productivity won't be as high, but we'll have to wait and see. Okay, well, why don't we move on? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I thought I saw a question, but it was something else.
All right, well, we're going to switch over now and welcome Dr. Curry Cunningham, who is a quantitative ecologist with the University of Washington's Alaska Salmon Program and an assistant professor at the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences for the University of Alaska Fairbanks. His research focuses on population dynamics and fisheries management. And today we'll hear from Dr. Cunningham on exploring and implementing and the implementation of machine learning methods for predicting Bristol Bay salmon run timing. So we're going to be talking about timing. And I also want to note that we have Dr. Ray Hilborn with us today to answer questions as well. Dr. Hilborn is a professor of aquatic and fishery sciences and a researcher with the Alaska Salmon Program, focuses on how to best manage fisheries and provide sustainable benefits to human society. And recently, Dr. Hilborn's work has focused on the role of fish in the global food system and the comparative environmental costs of different food sources, what's their carbon footprint and things like that. So take it away, Curry.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for coming out this morning. As Andy said, I'm switching the focus a little bit to talk about predictions for run timing in Bristol Bay and some of the work that we have ongoing that's been funded by BBRCA, funded by the fleet, funded by you. So when I talk about run timing over the course of the next few minutes, I'm talking about differences year to year in what we think of as the midpoint date for the run to either Bristol Bay as a whole or to individual fishing districts. And so that midpoint is the day at which the season total or 50% of the season total catch and escapement has been observed inshore. So what I have plotted here across time, this is the differences from average run timing. So 0 would be an average run timing. On the plus side, these are late years. On the negative side, these are early years. So about 4 days early in this year. And for Bristol Bay as a whole, what we see is this sort of interesting pattern. Historically, run timing bounced around quite a bit, but in the recent past, we've seen these two really pronounced periods. So in this period from 2009 to 2014, we had sort of on time to early run timing to Bristol Bay as a whole. And in this 2015 era, this era of higher than average production that Chris talked about a little while ago, we've seen on average sort of later run timing to Bristol Bay as a whole. Of course, we can break this down to individual fishing districts, Ugashig, Igigik, Naknek, Kvichak, and Nushagak, and we see slightly different patterns by district, but this later than average run timing in this post-2015 period was pretty well represented in both the Naknek, Kvichak district and the Igigik district. And I'll point out this really interesting, very late signal of run timing in the Ugashig district in 2019. So I probably don't need to tell this crowd why we think run timing is important, but it's important for a couple of reasons. Obviously, everybody wants to know when to have their boat in the water. The processors want to know when to have their crews in place and trained and ready to go and start receiving fish. And from the perspective of the in-season forecast work that our group does, we're interested because our predictions for run abundance, for the number of fish coming back that we update throughout the season, can be pretty sensitive to deviations from either early or deviations from average run timing. You tend to over forecast the number of fish coming back when run timing is early. You tend to under forecast when run timing is later than average. So our goal here has really been to see if we can employ some modern machine learning techniques to try to improve our predictions for run timing based on a whole range of environmental factors. And for those who aren't familiar, machine learning really is a part of our everyday lives now, whether we're talking about weather forecasts, whether we're talking about those handy suggestions on Amazon for what we want to purchase next based on our purchase history in the past, suggestions for what to type when you go to write an email, or things like ChatGPT. I don't know if this crowd's familiar with it. If not, ask your children. They're probably already trying to figure out how to use ChatGPT to write essays for them. All of these are kind of examples of machine learning, complex algorithms that we can train on data to generate predictions for us, to allow us to predict patterns into the future in general. So overall, the objectives of this project were first really to identify a range of environmental conditions that might be associated with Bristol Bay sockeye run timing. And this is sort of based on first principles, right? Location in the ocean. We want variables that represent the place in time and in space where that sockeye are occupying, or Bristol Bay sockeye are occupying. Probably something to do with feeding or migration pathways. The other key part of this project was to develop a kind of an operational workflow to automatically kind of scrape the internet, scrape websites and data repositories from NOAA and from NASA to easily import the environmental data we want to base these machine learning forecasts for run timing on. So it's easy to implement in the future. You can run the code, you can pull in all the data, update these data sets automatically. So we're set for making predictions into the future. And of course, to explore which machine learning methods are capable of generating some predictions for run timing and asking how well they actually work. One of the challenges that I'll talk more about is that most of these machine learning methods are pretty well adapted to large data sets. And that's something we don't really have the benefit of when we're talking about run timing year over year. So in terms of the environmental variables that we looked at to incorporate and attempt to predict run timing, a key one was Bering Sea sea ice, thinking about sea ice extent and the rate of ice retreat. So, most people are familiar with the fact that sea ice in the Eastern Bering Sea, as we go into the spring, can have a really big impact on temperature conditions in the Eastern Bering Sea and Bristol Bay regions. It can have legacy effects in terms of pools of cold water on the bottom, can have trophic effects, sort of production of phytoplankton and zooplankton. So sea ice really is a dominant driver in our area up here when we think about processes driving the nearshore marine environment. So Bering Sea sea ice is one of them. Right here in blue, this is basically the pattern in sea ice over the winter. The black line is the historical average from 1991 to 2020. Here we are in blue. This is 2023 up through April 28th at least. And what we see is that we had kind of bounced around, but had slightly below average sea ice conditions in the Eastern Bering Sea, and certainly lower than what we saw last winter in the winter of 2021, 2022. But that spring sea ice is predicting is persisting a bit longer than what we saw last year, or at least last spring, in the spring of 2022. So sea ice being one of the predictors we're bringing in. The other ones are, of course, temperature. As Daniel talked about, temperature is a key driver not only of early marine survival, but potentially of, run timing in this context. Whether or not individual fish are feeding well or poorly might influence whether or not they're staying out at sea a bit longer to grow a bit bigger before returning, or impacting the migration pathway in different ways. So we looked at both surface temperatures and bottom temperatures, particularly in the inner shore or on the Eastern Bering Sea shelf, kind of down in this area. We also looked at some of those broad scale ocean indices that Daniel just talked about, the PDO, the NPGO, and the sort of El Nino pattern. Again, these are broad scale ocean indices describing patterns in climate. sea surface temperatures, pressure, winds, things like that. So real broad descriptors of the state of the North Pacific. And we wanted to ask whether or not those have any predictive capacity when it comes to run timing. The other thing we looked at were these wonderfully long time series of data that actually come from the regional airports. Some of the longest time series we have, our satellite data products go back to the 90s. There's some ocean mooring buoys and oceanography surveys that go out that go a little further back. But our regional airports, King Salmon, Cold Bay, have these incredible time series of data, including temperature, precipitation, rain and snowfall. And so we're able to bring those in and provide some additional information potentially to inform kind of what the conditions are on land that influences maybe stream and river temperature through ice melt that may have an impact on run timing as well. So these long time series of environmental data from airports are incredibly useful and shouldn't be overlooked. So this brings us to some of the sort of key questions involved here when we think about linking run timing to environmental processes. And of course, we want to know, as an ecologist, right, which of these environmental factors are important, right, for prediction. From a practical perspective, we want to know how reliably we can predict run timing. And we do this through, fitting these models to a training data set and then predicting out a sample to a testing data set and seeing how well we do to give us an idea of how much trust we should have in our forecasts. And there's this sort of underlying question, which of these machine learning methods actually work well for short time series? We think about, I'm talking about predicting run timing from about 1965 up to 2022, or fitting data to that time series. But really, a lot of these machine learning methods, rather than usually being fit to data sets with 60 data points, right? We think that's a long time series. They're really well adapted to hundreds, if not thousands of data points. So there's this key question of which of these methods actually work well when we have relatively short time series in the context of machine learning. And so the machine learning method that I'm going to be talking about today that we found to have sort of superior performance over some of the other ones that we tried were what are called boosted regression trees. And it's just a fancy way of saying that you come up with a complex set of decision rules. Basically, if, near shore temperatures were above X level, then run timing tended to be earlier or later than some level. And so you build these really complex sets of decision rules conditional on the data. And when I say you, I mean the algorithm does it. And then the boosting part is that you then look at the years where you had a pretty poor prediction, you train a new tree or series of decision rules and map that on and see if you can improve your overall predictive performance. And by stacking these trees together, you hope to be able to come up with a pretty robust way to generate predictions. At least that's the goal. So there's a couple key pieces of information that we get out. One is the relative importance of the predictors, kind of which of the predictors that went into this machine learning method actually had more or less information to contribute in terms of predicting run timing. And this is an example for Bristol Bay as a whole. It differs a little bit when we go district by district, but we see that some of the top predictors for Bristol Bay, North Pacific Gyre Oscillation, the NPGO, this is the cold pool extent, sort of persistence of cold water below 2 degrees on the bottom of the Eastern Bering Sea in the previous summer. Cold pool extent, sea surface temperature in the Eastern Bering Sea in the previous summer. And of course, what the run timing was to Bristol Bay as a whole 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. So this sort of legacy, if it was basically, if run timing was early or late 2 years ago, that seems to have some benefit in predicting what the run timing is likely to be this year. And down here, of course, this is sort of air temperature at the King Salmon Airport being a predictor further down the line, but of some importance. The other key piece of information we get out is these what we call partial plots that basically describe the relationship between run timing on the y-axis, so positive values being later run timing, negative values being earlier run timing, and the value of that predictor variable, so a low value versus a high value. And so what we see down here That seems to suggest that when there's a greater extent of the cold pool in the previous summer, those cold waters at the bottom of the Eastern Bering Sea shelf, we tend to see earlier run timing. So this is kind of the directionality and shape of the relationships that seem to be estimated. Of course, more important than that, we're probably interested in model performance. So I'll step through a few of these plots for Bristol Bay as a whole and district by district. And really, we're trying to ask this question: how well does this machine learning model work? And to do this, we basically train the model on 80% of our input years and observations, and then try to back predict the remaining 20% out of sample. So here, each of these points are an individual year. That red line is a one-to-one line. On the x-axis, we have observed run timing. On the y-axis, we have predicted run timing. If our model was perfect, all these points would fall right beautifully along that red line. But of course, we operate in the real world. And so those blue points are from our testing data set. So kind of within sample predictions, or excuse me, our training data set are purple. So our within sample predictions, our blue points are our predictions out of sample. And what we see is that in general, yeah, we're getting reasonably robust predictions. You know, when run timing was observed to be late, run timing is predicted to be late. We tend to have a bigger problem for Bristol Bay as a whole in predicting these early years. That is to say that the machine learning method, when the true run timing was early, tends to not estimate that run timing was as early as it ended up being. That is to say that we don't get as robust predictions for early run timing as we do for late run timing. We can break this down also district by district. So the Nushagak district, Igigik district, Naknek, Kvichak, and Ugashik. Again, ideal world, all our points fall on that red one-to-one line. We see that we get decent predicted performance for the Nushagak district, Igigik, a little worse for Naknek, Kvichak as a whole. And again, this sort of challenge with not predicting those early run timings as well as we might hope. Ugashik is another story. Turns out it's really hard to predict using these methods. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of those being the way we quantify run timing to Ugashik is a function of, catch and escapement. And one of the things we know about the Ugashik district is that in big Igigik years, you tend to catch a decent number of Igigik fish in Ugashik. So this can really shift around our perception of run timing to the Ugashik district. But in general, this tends to be hard to predict, I think, because of this impact on catch, and particularly early catch of fish bound for other districts. But in general, what we see across the board is that predicted performance is accurate to within about 1 or 2 days, but there's still uncertainty there, as we might expect. So in general, kind of what have we learned here? Well, short time series, 1965 to 2022, sounds like a pretty long time period, but it's only about 60 data points. And as I said before, this can be challenging for some of our ML methods. Some of the key predictors that seem to pop up over and over again for these different districts: the NPGO, prior year's run timing, ice extent in the Eastern Bering Sea, and this sort of legacy, a cold pool on the bottom of the Eastern Bering Sea, and king salmon air temperature. In terms of performance, I would say it's reasonable. We see this error rate of about 1 to 2 days, except for Ugashik. We have a lot of trouble predicting Ugashik run timing in this context. In terms of our predictions for run timing in 2023, overall for Bristol Bay as a whole, we're predicting run timing to be slightly late, about 0.7 days, right? Late to on time. Igigik about 1.3 days late. Naknek Kvichak district about 3.3 days later than the long-term average. Nushagak kind of on time to early, about half a day early. And then the Ugashik prediction is for basically on time. But again, I put that little caveat in there, caution. I wanted to highlight some of the other cool machine learning research that's going on in our lab. So a postdoc in my lab, Dr. Joe Langen, and I are coordinating some research to try to bring together a bunch of historical high sea salmon survey data collected by a range of countries, US, Canada, Russia, Japan, from the 1950s up to the 2000s, and to try to learn about sort of distribution of salmon in the marine environment. And I thought this crowd might find it a little interesting. Each of these points are an individual high sea survey observation, either from a gill net or a long line. Across the summer months, the majority of sampling tended to occur in the summer. and across time periods. So this is the 70s up to the 90s. And more recently, you'll notice that there's been a reduction in the amount of Hi-C sampling. But some of the cool products that come out of this are predictions for where we have high catch rates for sockeye across the North Pacific over time. So you'll see time counting up here. And we sort of see, I'll wait for this to play again. We get some really interesting predictions going from April, more red colors, higher expected abundance. As we get into May and early June, we tend to see higher abundance here, Eastern Bering Sea up into the Bristol Bay region. So kind of some fun ways that we can extend these same machine learning methods to not only ask questions about predicting run timing, but also predicting where sockeye salmon are in space. And with that, I wanted to thank BBRSDA, of course, for funding to support this research, and by extension to you, the fleet as a whole. Wanted to thank the ADF&G scientists and technicians for collecting the data, thinking about counts of salmons and harvest that really allows me to do this type of work. And of course, to thank NOAA and NASA for all the ecosystem data that I was able to bring in for these types of analyses. And if there's time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Very fascinating stuff. Thank you, Curry. So yeah, again, raise your hand if you have any questions, and or put those in the chat. Mark Monroe asks, have you had any input into the West Coast king or chum problem? I'm not sure if that's directed at RSTA or the scientists.
The short answer from my end is no.
Although it is, Fish and Game and NOAA have some recent data on how well those chum juveniles are feeding in the ocean. And during this period of really warm ocean temperatures, they have been pretty skinny and the quality of their food's pretty meager. So if you were to ask me where's the leading indicator of what the chum problem is, it seems like climate conditions have translated into pretty poor feeding conditions for Western Alaska chum. Not a perfect story, but I would say that's the best hypothesis at this point.
Okay. Could these machine learning models be adapted for Bristol Bay king and chum fairly easily, or not really, Curry?
For predicting timing or abundance?
Abundance, mostly.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, right? You need it all depends on what your response variable is, right? You need a pretty good metric for the number or reconstruction of the number of king salmon returning or the number of chum returning. So if you have a pretty good indicator of what run size is from year to year, this is something we could try out, right?
And of course, I suppose, going back to the sonar challenges and the counting challenges we have with kings, if you don't, if you're not real certain on what those are, then it makes it, you're kind of starting with shaky data going in for models.
I will say for, kind of the spatial machine learning questions that I sort of pointed to at the end, we are doing that for chum and we are doing that for king salmon as well, and are expanding that to use kind of catch rates in trawl fisheries as well, to try to put some tools together to better predict where ground fish fleets are likely to encounter chum salmon in particular, so they can avoid them a bit better.
Okay, that's good news. And we have heard that Fish and Game has plans to upgrade and try to improve the sonar and the counting methods there, especially for kings. Maybe not going to ask you to do it off the top of your head, but I'd assume the different areas have different midpoints as far as what that 0-day level is or date is. Maybe that's something you could get to us and we could put it in the blog post, so that
Sure.
when we're talking about being 0.5 days earlier or later, and kind of peg that to what that historically has been.
Yeah.
Kevin Doherty is asking, what were conditions like about 10 years ago, where the peak run was around June 21st, by far the earliest run in my career. Did I get that,
On timing,
Kevin? Yeah, as far as timing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd have to look back at that specific year. About 10 years ago. Sorry, going back to here. Right, so this would be 2010, 11, 12, 2013 was that earliest run that at least when we're looking at the midpoints of these returns. I'd have to look back and see what the specific conditions were, but that was certainly an early year, and we could look at, in terms of predictive performance. One of the things that I tried to highlight is that we don't do as good a job of predicting those early years as we do using these methods of predicting those late years. So that's one thing to consider, right? We're probably less likely to predict an extreme early run like 2013 compared to some of these later runs that we've seen more recently.
Yeah, interesting. Good question, Kevin. We'll try to get an answer on that. Let's see, I think we have a hand up, possibly, or not. Daniel, I think, has his hand up, but maybe that's just leftover.
no, I had a question for Curry that may lead to an answer that others might be interested in, and that's whether you consider run size as a predictor of run timing. That was question one, and question two is, instead of using the midpoint of the run, if you use an alternative metric such as the date at which the first million is hit in the district, because that may be of relevance to the fleet as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in response to your second question, no, I've just been looking at the midpoint, but we could craft those kind of metrics for run timing however we want, a date at which the first million are seen, date at which you've seen kind of 75% of the run pass, or arrive in shores, catch, or escapement. Those are all great ideas. In terms of the second question, I haven't brought in the preseason forecast information on abundance or historical abundance to as a predictor, but that's a good suggestion as well.
Yeah, because I think the size of the run affects how wide the distribution is of arrival timing. So that may have an important effect that may help the forecast.
Yeah, I think the other question is, as Chris pointed out, and others have as well, including you, right? In these big run years, you tend to have smaller fish. And if we think about an individual fish swimming in terms of body lengths per second, smaller fish are probably swimming a little bit slower. And it'd be interesting to see if that's borne out as well.
Yeah, good thought there. Would you mind showing up that slide about the predictions for each river system in 20?
Oh, absolutely.
Was
Sorry,
asking a little more time
through
on that.
that down.
And seems like probably a good one to put in the blog post. And again, there's there's margin for error here, certainly. So just bear that in mind. But I think in general, it was the Nushagak being early a half day. Yeah, there it is. Naknek-Kvichak modeling out as the latest of the districts. Egegik, that maybe a day late, and then Ushagak kind of hard to call.
Yeah. And so these are all relative to their internal kind of long-term averages. So Naknek-Kvichak districts always a bit later than the Nushagak and Egegik districts, generally the earlier running. So this is relative to their sort of average timing within a district. And Ugashik's always going to be sort of the latest arriver in Bristol Bay, even if it's on time.
Can you say when the Nushagak would typically reach that 50%?
Yeah, here I have a slide on that. I pulled it out of my presentation at the last minute. Let me throw that up here. Sorry, give me just 1 second. Additional slides.
Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Oh, no worries. I'll just share my screen again over here. So this is the distribution across years of that midpoint date to each of these districts. So in general, we see across time kind of the median of the midpoint dates is, somewhere around 4th, 5th of July for Igigik, Nushagak, maybe a tiny bit later there, Naknek, Kujak, Ugashik, and of course Togiak. So if you had to, midpoint date here for Igigik, always right around 4th, 5th of July, at least in terms of when you see 50% of season total catch and escapement.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions or hands up. So I think we can call it good there. And we're running just a bit over an hour here. So, again, want to thank the scientists with Alaska Salmon Program. Really interesting work that they're doing. I think it really helps, the more accurate these forecasts can be. And if we can even better get a sense of run timing, obviously that helps fishermen. I think one thing we've seen in the past from a market standpoint too is, the markets and the processors and the buyers, they're looking at forecasts as well, and plans are made off of those. And so, the more accurate that can be, the better it helps the supply chain plan for. And that was, kudos, I think, to these forecasters for seeing that this massive 2022 harvest coming, and I guess having the stones to, go with what the models say, because that allowed, fishermen, processors, and everybody down the chain to be prepared for that as much as we could be. Honestly, I think I've said in other presentations, it's hard to push 40% more fish, into a market, especially with kind of economic headwinds. But their work really helps inform, a lot of what industry does. So thank you guys. All right. Well, again, thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. And with that, we'll sign off.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.